An elderly man approached the airport check-in counter, confidently handing over his passport. The attendant glanced at his details, then froze, her eyes widening as she called her supervisor over in a hushed voice. Within minutes, security personnel surrounded him, and medical professionals were summoned to examine the impossible details printed on his documentation. The early morning sun cast long shadows across the bustling airport terminal as travelers rushed to their destinations. Among the crowds, an elderly man stood out like a relic from another time. He wandered aimlessly between check-in counters, his outdated tweed jacket and weathered leather suitcase drawing curious glances from passers-by. His eyes darted nervously around the modern facility, clearly overwhelmed by the digital displays and self-service kiosks that dominated the space. Several travelers brushed past him impatiently, while others cast concerned glances in his direction. A kind-hearted airport official named Mark noticed the man's distress from across the terminal. Mark had seen this before. Elderly passengers overwhelmed by the rapid technological changes in air travel. He approached with a warm smile, gently asking if the man needed assistance. The elderly gentleman's face immediately brightened with relief. The man explained to Mark that he was traveling to his great-granddaughter's wedding, an event he simply couldn't miss. Mark listened patiently as the elderly traveler described his confusion. With gentle guidance, Mark led the man toward a staffed check-in counter where a human attendant could assist him properly. At the counter, a friendly attendant named Sarah greeted them with a professional smile. The elderly man fumbled inside his jacket pocket and produced his passport and travel documents. The passport immediately caught Sarah's attention. It was an incredibly old model, one she had never personally handled before in her years of service. Sarah opened the passport with curiosity, examining it. As her eyes scanned the personal information page, her expression suddenly changed. The professional smile vanished, replaced by a look of utter disbelief. She blinked rapidly, reading the information again, as if to confirm she hadn't made a mistake. Without saying a word, Sarah whispered something to her supervisor, who quickly came over to examine the document. The supervisor's eyes widened just as Sarah's had, and he stared at the passport with an expression of shock before looking up at the elderly man with newfound curiosity. The elderly gentleman shifted uncomfortably, not understanding what had caused such a reaction. The supervisor stepped away and made a phone call, speaking in hushed tones while repeatedly glancing back at the elderly traveler. Within minutes, 2 security personnel arrived at the counter. They spoke briefly with the supervisor before approaching the elderly man with professional courtesy. They explained that they needed to ask him a few questions and requested that he accompany them to a private room. Though confused by this unexpected development, the man nodded cooperatively. As they escorted him through the terminal, an announcement echoed through the speakers. His flight was now boarding. The elderly man became visibly anxious, explaining repeatedly to the officers that he could not afford to miss this flight. His great-granddaughter's wedding was the following day, and his entire family was expecting him to be there. It meant everything to them and to him that he attended. The security personnel assured him they were working to resolve the situation as quickly as possible. Inside the room, the man's anxiety grew with each passing minute. He had no idea why his passport had caused such a reaction or why he was being detained when his flight was preparing to depart. Frustrated and increasingly worried, he suggested they call his son to verify his identity. Perhaps there had been some mistake with his documentation that his family could clarify. When provided with a number, an officer placed the call and spoke briefly with the man's son. On speakerphone, the son confirmed his father's identity with absolute certainty, his voice warm with affection as he mentioned that despite his advanced years, his father had always been stubbornly independent, a trait that both impressed and worried the family. He had insisted on traveling alone despite their offers to accompany him. Not long after, a woman in a white coat entered the room, clearly a medical professional of some kind. She introduced herself as Dr. Reyes and began asking the elderly man unusual questions about his health history. The questions seemed oddly off for what should have been a simple passport verification. Still, he spoke of a near-fatal health crisis he had experienced in his 40s, an event that had completely transformed his perspective on life and health. While many of his peers had continued with unhealthy lifestyles, he had made radical changes to his daily routine. He described to Dr. Reyes how he had switched to eating only natural, unprocessed foods decades before such diets became popular. He detailed his daily rituals: ice baths every morning regardless of the weather, yoga practice at dawn and dusk, and long walks through the countryside surrounding his rural home. Even now, he explained, he maintained these practices without fail. When they asked the elderly man if he knew why they were questioning him so thoroughly, he suggested with a slight smile that perhaps it was because he looked good for his age. The comment hung in the air, met with uncomfortable silence from the officials. The senior official finally addressed the issue directly. He asked if the man was aware of what his passport indicated about his age. The date of birth listed in the document, March 15, 1905, would make him 120 years old. The official asked if this information was correct, his tone suggesting he expected the elderly man to express surprise or offer some explanation for the obvious error. Instead, the man simply nodded calmly, as if the question referred to something as ordinary as the color of his eyes. To him, his age was merely a fact, unusual perhaps to others, but familiar to himself. His casual acknowledgement stunned everyone in the room into silence. With a gentle smile, the elderly man reached into his leather suitcase and produced an old photo album. The book itself was clearly antique, its binding carefully repaired multiple times over the decades. Inside were yellowed photographs spanning generations, each with dates meticulously written beneath them. Dr. Reyes asked if she could conduct a brief physical examination, to which the man agreed without hesitation. Her assessment revealed blood pressure readings typical of a healthy 60-year-old, remarkable flexibility, and notably sharp mental acuity. She tested his short-term memory and cognitive functions, finding no signs of deterioration, common even in people decades younger. As the evidence mounted, the officials began to accept the seemingly impossible truth. They were indeed in the presence of a 120-year-old man who defied everything medical science understood about human aging. The senior official apologized for the unwarranted delay and immediately arranged for the man to receive special accommodation. The airline, upon learning of the extraordinary circumstances, upgraded the elderly man to business class. As he prepared to board, word of his remarkable age spread throughout the airport staff. People requested photos with him, treating him with a reverence typically reserved for celebrities. As he finally boarded his flight, he left behind dozens of stunned airport staff clutching their phones with newly taken selfies and thoughts of changing their lifestyles for good. The simple passport check had transformed into a profound moment of inspiration for everyone involved. And what about you? If you could change your lifestyle to potentially add decades to your life, which habits would you be willing to adopt starting tomorrow?